John Croy, Cranston, Jack Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
Hello, welcome to Card Table. So we're on to volume 22, which is Lowball. I mentioned in a previous video when I was talking about the idiosyncrasies of these different cycles, these 3-book cycles, that since the Tor relaunched, it seemed like maybe they made a conscious effort to make the first book in a triad have some closure on its own, so that you didn't get to the end of the book and just feel like that to get any kind of emotional closure or catharsis or satisfaction on any of the plot threads, that you had to wait however many months or years until the next book. That they really wanted to make sure that the first book in and of itself was this satisfying experience. And I think they really accomplished that, first with Inside Straight, which is volume 18, which is the start of the Committee Triad, and then with Fort Freak, which I talked about already, being the start of the Mean Streets Triad. And, you know, I've already said in the previous videos that I think Fort Freak is really very satisfying on its own. You get a complete, very complex murder mystery with a lot of moving parts, and you get to the end and you get the solution. The mystery is solved, the guilty parties face justice, and, you know, there's closure and redemption and a lot of happy endings, you know, and a few tragic endings in there too. But either way, endings, just overall a very clear-cut, self-contained read for the first book of the Mean Streets Triad. So yeah, Fort Freak is just in every way successful. Then when I talked about Busted Flush, the middle of the Committee Triad, I did note that the double edge to that sword is that you're putting more onus upon the second book in your triad to start more things, because in the early triads of the original 15, there was so much left open at the end of book 1 of a triad that when you got to book 2, you could hit the ground running because everything was already set up and established, and all the many threats and villains at large, they're already there for you, and you could just start the book at full speed, you know, because so much had already been established. But with Busted Flush, and I think this is true of Lowball as well, because you got so much closure out of volume 1, in this case, you know, Fort Freak gave you such a complete experience. So now Lowball has this job of kind of revving it up again and saying, okay, you know all the characters, like, because once again it's about the Fort Freak precinct, the 5th precinct, the Jokertown precinct, and it's all the familiar cast members, but all the crimes were solved at the end of Fort Freak. So it's like, okay, we need some new crimes. So Lowball actually starts 2 years later, so that we're in the midst of a new case, which is the disappearance of Jokers out of Jokertown. And so over the course of Lowball, it's this new mystery that has to kind of unspool, involving the kidnapping of Jokers to this club, or this establishment in Talas, or Talis, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, city in Kazakhstan, where this fight club, this illegal fight club is taking place. These Jokers that are being kidnapped, the reason they're being kidnapped is to fight in these illegal matches, but essentially against their will. There are certain ace operatives that are making this all possible, you know, so they've got a teleporter who can, you know, make it so that they can instantaneously take these Jokers from New York to Kazakhstan. They've got a Joker whose power, or several Jokers whose powers help them to subdue the Jokers in the first place, so that they can get them into their van and drive them through their little teleportational portal and go to Kazakhstan. Once they're in the fight club, they've got aces who have psychic abilities that allow them to coerce the Jokers into fighting, that are able to sort of punish them psychically if they refuse to fight. And then over the course of the book, we also get some intimations as to the motivations for why this fight club is why it even exists. You know, obviously it could just be that it's for profit, but it turns out that there's kind of a more sinister reason, which then plays into the concluding book, High Stakes. It's a middle book, like I mentioned with Busted Flush. With these middle books, they take a lot of stories and break them into many parts so that they can all kind of interweave with each other. And in this case, that happens with the interstitial there's sort of two, I guess you could argue they're both interstitials, because they're both pretty consistently in the book from the very start right to the end. One of them is about a member of the Fort Freak Police Department, Francis Black, Linda Snodgrass's character, and then Michael Cassett writes a character called Stuntman, who at this point in the series is an operative of Scare. He originally appeared in Michael Cassett's story in Inside Straight as one of the contestants on the reality show, but now he's an agent of Scare. So you get back into that whole milieu of Scare, which John Joseph Miller had already done a lot of work in establishing some of some familiar agents. That so anytime that Scare is part of the story, we see the same sort of familiar faces: Carnifex, Lady Black, Midnight Angel. There's a character called Moon, and now Stuntman. I think Stuntman was established as an agent of Scare in Volume 19. Busted Flush. Through a particular set of circumstances, Stuntman and Francis Black kind of team up to investigate these kidnapped Jokers. Similar to Fort Freak in that there are different sort of branches of this mystery, which allow different authors with their particular POV characters to sort of have different characters kind of investigating a particular branch. And maybe learning something that then feeds back into the main narrative, the main mystery. Which is kind of how Fort Freak worked, where Sherry Priest doing the Leo Storgman story, trying to solve the rat hole murders. But then there were these side stories is the wrong phrase, but Vic Milan's internal affairs guy, and Detective Stevens, the Marianne Mahanraj character, and some of these other threads that then would feed back into Sherry Priest's story, and maybe give Leo Storgman another lead or whatever. So they do that kind of structure again with Lowball. I don't think it's as elegant. It's not quite as smooth. It doesn't feel. Somehow Fort Freak did a great job of making it feel very organic. It didn't feel contrived the way these different branches of the story played out in their own individual narratives, but also fed back into the interstitial. It was so smooth and it clicked together. So they made it look easy in Fort Freak. They really did. And in Lowball, you can kind of see that, maybe it's not that easy. It's somehow it doesn't feel quite as organic. But there are a few things that kind of leap out as being pretty cool to me in this one. There are 4 stories that really jump out at me in this, or there are 4 stories that I think really shine in this one, particularly, I would argue. One of them is Walter John Williams, who I think this is the first time we see him in a book since the Tor relaunch. And he was always a favorite of mine. I think maybe for a lot of Wildcards fans, he's a favorite. I mean, he's pretty damn good, so I can't see why not. So Walter John Williams is back writing about this, I believe it's a forensic pathologist, working in the morgue, garnering clues just by investigating these dead bodies. And the character, he's referred to as Gordon the Ghoul, and I can't remember what his real name is, but it actually puts me in mind. My cousin of mine who works as a police officer, he was talking about how the people who do this, who are in a morgue dissecting bodies, he's like, they're smart. They're some of the smartest police officers you'll ever meet. They can figure out so much just by dissecting a body. And that's kind of a theme of this story, or a motif of this story, that this Gordon character in some cases almost solves the entire mystery just by looking at a body, but he gets no credit because he then tells a detective what he's figured out. It's the detective who goes out and makes the arrest and gets the collar and gets the credit. But yeah, it's a good story. I mean, Walter John Williams is just always he's always a winner. And then David D. Levine writes this character who online they call him the cartoonist, but he's never called that in the story. When I saw something on George R. Martin's blog, maybe. Or maybe in a profile of David D. Levine or Levine. Here are some of the characters he's created, and one of them was the cartoonist. And it took me a second. I was like, the cartoonist? Who's that? Oh, right, of course. I mean, it makes sense as a name when you read about the character, but it made me think, oh, so this character is somebody. Like, he's not just a one-off, which is good because he's awesome. I guess that's my roundabout way of saying they got to bring this guy back for more stories because, like, he's fantastic. One of my favorite new post relaunch characters. But yeah, this character who's kind of this sort of really badly deformed Joker who I guess it's suggested that even other Jokers find him a little sickening to look at, which would mean he'd have to be really bad. I feel like it's always been implied that there's a lot of hideous mutations in Jokertown. But this guy's particularly malformed, but he's able to create drawings and then they become 3-dimensional. And these cartoon characters can then go and, adhering only to sort of cartoon rules of physics, can just kind of bounce around from building to building, and he can see through that character's eyes and control it and do all the things that he can't do in his own kind of deformed, kind of almost hobbled kind of body that he's stuck in. And just this idea of these sort of goofy, kind of Robert Crumb-ish characters with crazy biology, out of proportion heads or whatever else, or anthropomorphic animals, all sorts of possibilities. And so far we've only seen him in this one story. Once again, I can't remember his real name, even though that's what they call him by in the story because they don't call him the cartoonist. But whatever the character's name is, I'm going to say it's maybe Gary. Whatever his name is, we've only seen him in this one book in Lowball, and so far he's not come back. That sucks. I really hope he's back soon. David D. Levine has told a story about how he actually pitched a team up between the cartoonist and the sleeper for the upcoming sleeper book. got nixed for kind of what sounds like kind of a silly reason, at least to me. I won't repeat it, but kind of a bummer. When I heard that, I was like, oh man, just let him do his cartoonist story. So yeah, the cartoonist, that's another one I want to see more of. Ian Tregillis gives us another Rust Belt story, and those are always fun. Tregillis has a great way of pulling at the heartstrings with this character who's this sort of the angel of Wildcard, is this incredibly naive and good-hearted guy who, no matter how much he lives amongst the sort of corruptions and intrigues of the Wildcards universe, he still never kind of loses his innocence. It's always fun to see Tregillis come back and give us more of that character. And then Carrie Vaughn does another kind of throwback to the Committee era, because Rust Belt is a member of the Committee, and so are characters like John Fortune and Drummer Boy and Earth Witch and Curveball. And so Carrie Vaughn in Lowball tells us a story about a team up among John Fortune, Drummer Boy, Curveball, and Earth Witch. I mentioned the male names first in my sexist way. It's really more about Curveball and Earth Witch, but John Fortune and Drummer Boy show up as well. So yeah, that's another one that works really well. So then the book ends on a cliffhanger, which takes us into high stakes, which we'll talk about next time, and we'll leave it at that.
To try and give our love back some sparks. He said, we'll get your love growing. But before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Shocks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.